The night my brother stood at the head of the conference table at Westfield Manor and announced to 40 of the company's most important business partners that I had been stealing from the family firm, he was smiling. I remember that detail more clearly than anything else about that evening. The width of the smile, the ease of it, the way it sat on his face like it belonged there, like he'd been rehearsing it for weeks, because I later learned he had. My name is Isla, and I have spent the last 6 years as a certified forensic accountant. My job, put simply, is to find the lies that numbers are used to tell. I examine financial records the way a surgeon examines tissue samples, with a magnifying glass, with patience, and with the absolute certainty that the truth is somewhere in there, even when someone has worked very hard to bury it. My colleagues sometimes call me the bloodhound, not because I'm aggressive, but because once I pick up a scent, I do not stop. It's the kind of compulsion that makes you good at your work and occasionally terrible at holiday dinners. My brother, on the other hand, has always been the golden child. He came into the world 3 years before me, and has spent every year since making sure our parents never forgot it. He is charming the way a salesman is charming, effortlessly, strategically, with a warmth that evaporates the moment the room empties. He joined the family business, Heart Meridian Logistics, the company our father built from a one-truck hauling operation into a $30 million freight management firm, straight out of college. I took a different path, got certified, built a career on the outside. But 8 months ago, when our father began quietly stepping back due to a heart condition, I agreed to come in as interim CFO while the company searched for a permanent hire. I want to be honest about what those 8 months were like. They were the hardest professional months of my life. Not because the work was beyond me, but because my brother made them that way. He had been the company's VP of operations for 4 years. He knew every vendor relationship, every contract, every handshake deal our father had ever made. He also knew, apparently, that an outside CFO would eventually start asking questions about the numbers he had been quietly reshuffling for longer than I had been there. I did not know this yet on the night of the gala. I was still trying to understand why certain vendor invoices didn't quite match their corresponding shipping records. I had flagged a few anomalies to my father's longtime accountant, a man who had been with the company since its founding. He had looked at me with uncomfortable eyes and said he'd look into it. He had not looked into it. The gala was Heart Meridian's 30th anniversary celebration. My mother had been planning it for most of the year, a formal dinner for 40 guests at Westfield Manor, a historic estate about 20 minutes outside the city that rented its ballroom to corporate events. The room was high-ceilinged and gold-lit, with round tables set with cream linens and centerpieces that probably cost more than my first apartment. My father sat at the head table in a new suit, looking healthier than he had in months. My mother floated between tables in a navy dress, radiant with the satisfaction of a woman whose hard work was yielding visible results. My brother gave the welcome toast. I will give him credit for this. He is a masterful public speaker. He talked about our father's vision, about the company's growth, about the legacy of the Heart name. The room was wrapped. Our father wiped his eyes. I sat 3 seats down and watched my brother work the crowd and felt, not for the first time, that I was watching a performance I didn't fully understand. The dinner plates had just been cleared when he asked for everyone's attention a second time. I remember thinking he was going to announce the new permanent CFO hire. We had been in final negotiations with a candidate for 2 weeks. Instead, he looked directly at me. "I want to take a moment," he said, his voice steady and regretful in a way that I recognized immediately as rehearsed, "to address something that's been very difficult for our family. Over the past several weeks, our internal audit process has identified some significant irregularities in our financial accounts. Irregularities that trace back to activity during the period when our current CFO," he paused just long enough, "my sister took over the role." He let it land. "We've shared this information with our board and are cooperating fully with an external review." The room went so quiet I could hear the chandeliers. I stared at him. My brain did that thing it sometimes does with data that doesn't make sense. It ran the input again, checked for errors, refused to process it as real. "I want to be clear," my brother continued, addressing the guests now, not me, "that this is not about blame. It's about protecting the company our father spent 30 years building. We believe in transparency, and we believe our partners deserve to know that we are addressing this with full seriousness." He sat down. The room exhaled in a murmur of shock and sympathy directed, I noticed, toward my father, who was sitting very still, and toward my brother, who had lowered his head in the manner of a man bearing a terrible burden. My mother reached across the table and touched my brother's arm, not my arm, his. I had not stolen anything. I need to be completely clear about that. I had never taken a single dollar from Heart Meridian that wasn't my salary. and I could account for every hour of every decision I'd made since walking in the door. But I was also a forensic accountant, which meant I understood exactly how this would look. My brother had just told 40 of the company's most important partners that I had been cooking the books. By morning, it would be in half a dozen inboxes. By the end of the week, it would be in the trades. I felt my face do something I am not accustomed to, which is nothing, just stillness. The kind of cold that comes not from shock but from a very specific, very professional recognition. I am looking at fabricated evidence. Someone has built a case, the case is against me. And the person who built it is sitting 12 feet away with his head bowed. I picked up my water glass. I took a slow sip. And then I looked across the table at the man sitting directly opposite me, a man I had been introduced to briefly at cocktail hour, a senior partner at Meridian's external audit firm who had been invited as a professional courtesy. His name was Mr. Ellsworth, and he was staring at my brother with an expression I had seen before, on the faces of people in my line of work. It was the expression of someone who has just heard a claim that does not quite add up. He caught my eye. I held his gaze for exactly 2 seconds, then I looked down at my bread plate and said nothing. That was the moment I made my decision. I did not cause a scene. I did not confront my brother in front of the guests. I did not cry, which I would not have done anyway, or storm out, which would have looked like guilt. I sat through the remainder of the dinner with the composure of someone who was very busy thinking. My brother moved through the room working hands and accepting sympathetic nods. My parents avoided looking at me. I ate my dessert, and when the evening ended, I walked to my car alone in the November cold, and sat behind the wheel for a long time without starting the engine. Then I drove home and began to work. Here is what my brother did not understand about me. What my family has never quite understood, though you'd think 6 years of watching me do this job would have taught them. I do not react, I reconstruct. My entire professional training is designed around the principle that emotions are noise and evidence is signal. And when those two things compete for your attention, you choose signal every time. He thought he had blindsided me. He had actually just handed me a starting point. I spent the next 2 weeks in a state I can only describe as surgical focus. I pulled every financial record I had access to from my tenure as CFO. I pulled older records, 3 years back, which were technically outside my standard scope, but which I had been granted access to during my first week for context and continuity. I am not certain my brother remembered that access existed. I pulled the vendor invoices I had already flagged. I pulled the shipping records. I pulled the wire transfer logs. And then I found it. It wasn't one thing. It was a pattern, careful, incremental, designed to stay just below the threshold that triggers automatic red flags. Invoices from a vendor called Crestline Freight Solutions, which did not appear anywhere in the company's approved vendor registry. Payments disbursed in amounts just small enough to avoid secondary review. A subsidiary account opened 18 months prior under a name similar enough to a real operational account that anyone scanning quickly would miss it. When I traced Crestline Freight Solutions to its registered agent, I found a shell company. When I traced the shell company, I found a name. My brother's name. He had been diverting money from Heart Meridian for at least 3 years. The total, conservatively, was close to $400,000. He had then created a paper trail, backdating certain transaction records, altering approval signatures, that pointed at activity during my CFO tenure. The problem with his plan, the fundamental flaw at its center, was that he was not a forensic accountant. He knew how to hide money. He did not know how to hide it from someone trained specifically to find it. I called an attorney the next morning. Not a family friend, not someone my father had recommended. A woman I had worked with on a corporate fraud case 3 years prior. Ms. Kavanaugh. She had the kind of reputation that makes opposing counsel visibly recalculate when she walks into a room. I told her everything. I showed her everything. She was quiet for a long moment after I finished. Then she said, "How long do you need to document the rest of this?" 4 days, I told her. "Take 5, she said, "be thorough." I was thorough. I documented every discrepancy, every altered record, every transaction tied to Crestline Freight Solutions. I cross-referenced shipping logs against GPS data from the company's own fleet management software, which my brother had apparently forgotten was stored in a separate system. The deliveries Crestline claimed to have made did not correspond to any of the fleet's actual routes. I had it in writing, time-stamped, sourced from 3 independent systems. I also quietly reached out to Mr. Ellsworth, not to reveal anything yet, but to ask if he would be willing to speak with my attorney in a professional capacity. He agreed without hesitation. When he and Mrs. Kavanaugh spoke, he told her that the internal audit my brother had referenced at the Gala had not been authorized by the company's board. He had no record of a formal audit process being initiated. The board had not been informed. What my brother had done, Mr. Ellsworth said carefully, was make a public accusation against a company officer at a corporate event, without any formal audit documentation to support it. He also told her something else. During my brief introduction at cocktail hour, I had mentioned the vendor discrepancy I had flagged, casually, the way one accountant mentions a puzzle to another. He had found it interesting enough to pull the company's public filing records that same evening before dinner began. He had, in his words, already had a feeling that something wasn't adding up, and it was not my numbers he was questioning. When Ms. Kavanaugh relayed this to me, I closed my eyes and sat very still. Then I said, "Get me a mediation date within 3 weeks." I did not tell my parents what I had found. Not yet. I let my brother believe his plan was proceeding exactly as intended. He sent me a single text during those 2 weeks. "I think it's best if you take some time away from the office while this gets sorted out." I did not respond. I went to the office every day, gathered what I needed, and said nothing. My family took my silence for guilt. I understand why. In our family, the pattern had always been, my brother accuses, I withdraw, peace is maintained. For 28 years I had played my part in that pattern. I was the quiet one, the technical one, the one who didn't make things harder than they had to be, the one who, if she was hurt, swallowed it and kept moving. I had spent 6 years becoming a person whose entire job was to refuse to accept manufactured reality. It had just taken me too long to apply that skill set to my own life. The mediation room was on the 14th floor of a building downtown, all glass and gray carpet. My brother arrived with a family attorney I recognized from my father's estate planning years ago, a man who handled wills and property transfers, and was, I could see from across the table, deeply uncomfortable with what was in front of him. My brother walked in first. He was wearing the good suit, the one he reserves for client meetings. He looked composed and practiced, and when he saw me sitting calmly beside Ms. Kavanaugh, something moved through his expression that he was not able to completely hide. My parents sat together on his side of the table. My father looked gray. My mother had her hands folded in her lap and would not look at me. "I think we can resolve this without it getting any messier," my brother said, his voice carrying the particular confidence of someone who believes he is the most powerful person in the room. Ms. Kavanaugh said agreed, and then she opened her folder. She did not rush. She laid out the documentation methodically, the way you walk someone through a financial statement line by line, giving them just enough time to understand each item before moving to the next. The vendor registry anomaly, the Crestline Freight Solutions invoices, the wire transfers, the shell company registration, the name attached to that registration, the backdated approval records, with a technical analysis from a digital forensics consultant, showing the metadata timestamps that didn't match what the documents claimed. She placed each page on the table. My brother's attorney had stopped taking notes by the 3rd page. He was just reading very quietly, with the expression of a man receiving information that significantly changes his understanding of the room he is in. My brother's composure lasted until the GPS fleet logs. He had apparently not known those records existed in a separately stored system. When Ms. Kavanaugh explained that the delivery records for Crestline Freight Solutions showed no correlation whatsoever to actual truck routes during the claimed service period, he made a sound that was not quite a word. "This is fabricated," he said. His voice had changed pitch. Ms. Kavanaugh did not pause. She placed the final document on the table, a sworn statement from Mr. Ellsworth, attesting that no formal internal audit had been initiated or authorized by the company's board prior to my brother's announcement at the gala, and that the accusation made against me in front of 40 witnesses had no documented evidentiary basis at the time it was made. The total funds diverted from Hart Meridian over a period of 38 months, Ms. Kavanaugh said, amounts to $412,000. Additionally, my client has suffered quantifiable professional damages as a result of a public, unsubstantiated accusation made in front of the company's key partners. She paused. "We are prepared to bring this to the district attorney's office this afternoon. We have already spoken with a contact there who reviewed our documentation and described the case as, and I am quoting directly, straightforward." My mother made a sound like something breaking. My father had not moved. My brother was staring at the table. Alternatively, Ms. Kavanaugh continued, my client is willing to resolve this through a civil settlement. Full financial restitution of $412,000, returned to Hart Meridian directly. A separate payment to my client of $220,000 for professional damages, lost income and reputational harm. My client's immediate reinstatement as interim CFO, with a formal letter of exoneration distributed to every partner who attended the anniversary gala. My client's name cleared in writing, publicly, no NDAs, no vague language, a plain statement that the accusations made at the event were false and based on falsified records. And my client's cooperation agreement. She will not pursue additional criminal charges, provided all terms are honored within 60 days. My brother finally looked up. He looked at me. Really looked at me. I think for the first time in 31 years he was seeing me clearly, not the quiet younger sister, not the technical one, not the one who never made waves. Someone who had spent 2 weeks being very, very still, and in that stillness had built something he could not dismantle. You have nothing, he said, but it came out thin. I looked back at him steadily. I have everything, I said. It's my job. His attorney asked for a recess. They spent 40 minutes in the hallway. My parents did not look at me during that 40 minutes. My mother pressed her fingers to her eyes. My father sat with his hands flat on the table and stared at the grain of the wood. Just before the hour was up, my father said quietly, to no one in particular, I built this company. He paused. I built it so both of you would have something. He did not say anything else, he did not have to. My brother came back into the room and signed. The aftermath was not clean. I won't pretend otherwise. The letter of exoneration went out to every partner on the Gala guest list within 2 weeks, professionally worded, clear, unambiguous. My brother's name was not in the letter, but everyone who needed to understand what had happened understood. The freight and logistics industry is not large, these things travel. My brother was removed from Hart Meridian's leadership team before the month was out, not by me, but by the board, which had reviewed the documentation and drawn its own conclusions. My parents did not fight this decision. I think seeing the evidence laid out in that mediation room had done something to them that I could not have accomplished with years of arguing or pleading. Numbers do not carry emotion, they simply are. And what the numbers said about my brother, written in $412,000 of diverted funds, could not be explained away with charm, or with tears, or with 30 years of favoritism. My mother called me 3 weeks after the mediation. It was a difficult call. She said she was sorry. I told her I heard her. I did not tell her that sorry was not a settlement, because I was tired and because some things take time to say out loud. We are not okay, my mother and I, but we are talking. That is more than I had expected. My father's health continued to improve, slowly. He called one Sunday afternoon and talked for a long time about the early years of the company. Before my brother and I were born, when it was just him and a borrowed truck and a ledger he kept by hand. He said he had never meant for us to see the company as something to compete over. I believed him. I also believed that he had, perhaps without fully recognizing it, created the conditions in which competition became inevitable. We talked around that. Maybe we'll get there eventually. The restitution was paid in full on the 53rd day. The $220,000 landed in my account on a Tuesday morning, and I sat with it for a long time before I did anything at all. Then I put most of it into the firm I had been building the groundwork for over the previous 6 months. Hart Forensic Accounting, which I know is perhaps not the subtlest name but which is mine. The name above the door. In 8 months, I have taken on 11 corporate clients, been retained on 2 ongoing fraud investigations, and received a formal professional referral from Mr. Ellsworth's firm, which has become one of my most consistent sources of new business. When I thanked him for his sworn statement, he told me he hadn't done it as a favor. I did it, he said simply, because the numbers were telling the truth, and someone needed to make sure the room heard them. I think about that often. The difference between someone who tells the truth and someone who makes sure the truth is heard. That is the work I want to spend my life doing, not just finding the deception, but constructing the case so carefully, so completely, that there is no space left for the deception to survive. My brother tried to bury me in a story he manufactured, but fabricated stories have a flaw that real ones don't. They leave evidence of their own construction. They leave timestamps and metadata and shell company registrations and GPS logs that don't align. They leave the spaces where the truth should have been, and in those spaces, if you know how to look, you find everything you need. I know how to look. I have always known how to look. I was just waiting for a reason to stop looking away. The morning I signed the lease on the office, I stood in an empty room on the 7th floor, facing a wall of east-facing windows that catch the light from about 8 in the morning until noon. I am not a sentimental person, but I stood there for a few minutes before I opened my laptop, and I thought about all the years I had made myself smaller, so that someone else's story could be the one that mattered. That version of the story is over. The one I'm writing now has much better numbers.